I want to thank everybody for coming out. It's nice to see so many people. I'm Alan Levine, a professor in the Department of Government and the director of the Political Theory Institute that's sponsoring this event. This is our last event of the academic year, so stay tuned next fall for more things. But we are here today to celebrate an impressive piece of scholarship. Why do they laugh when I say that? I didn't laugh. Hume and the Politics of Enlightenment, written by my colleague, Thomas W. Merrill. This book has already won a prize, the Delbo Winthrop Prize, for Best Recent Work in Political Philosophy. Tom is an associate professor here in the Department of Government at American University. He has co-edited 2 books before, Human Dignity and Bioethics, and Apples of Gold in Pictures of Silver, which was a festschrift for Leon Kass. He's also published articles in Polity, Review of Politics, Perspectives on Political Science, and others. He served as a senior research analyst at the President's Council on Bioethics. He's taught at St. John's College, Annapolis. He's had fellowships at the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton, and the Program on Constitutional Government at Harvard, as well as at the American Enterprise Institute. A blurb on the back of his book says, "Merrill has written a book that should have been written long ago." His wife, Jackie, who is here today, and I couldn't agree more. In fact, speaking for myself, this book gave me more pleasure than any in the past 7 years, because it meant that Tom earned tenure. The right, yes. The right to stay at AU for the rest of his career. Right. Or a punishment.
Sounds so good now that you mention it.
And I'm delighted at the prospect. He's my partner in crime in the Political Theory Institute that sponsors all of our events here. He is a great colleague, and I'm really delighted to have you with us at AU. But we're here today to celebrate, discuss, and hopefully even challenge the book itself. And we have 2 eminent scholars to help us do just that. Jerry Weinberger, who will speak first, is a professor emeritus at Michigan State University. He's the former director of the Lafrac Forum and co-director of the Symposium on Science, Reason, and Modern Democracy there. He's the author of 3 books, 10 edited books, and numerous articles, including 3 with the American Political Science Review, which is at the peak of our profession, the Journal of Politics and Political Theory. And much of his work throughout his career has revolved around the relationship between modern politics and the rise of modern science and technology, which is a major theme in Merrill's book that we're discussing today. So with a lifetime of rumination behind him, we're delighted to have you here to comment. And then speaking second will be John Scott, who is the professor and chair in the Department of Government at UC Davis, University of California, Davis. He has 4 articles in the American Political Science Review. Or it's 6. 6. He cranks them out faster than I can write them down. Including also 4 at the Journal of Politics and 4 at the American Journal of Political Science. I don't know anyone else in the profession who has published more in those top articles. He's also published books with Yale and the University of Chicago, including one on Hume and Rousseau. His work is on the Enlightenment generally, the politics of which is the subject of Merrill's book, and so we're delighted to have both of you here today. And so Jerry will speak first for 20 or 30 minutes, and then John and then Tom will have a chance to respond, and we'll open it up to questions from the floor.
I don't need this mic, do I?
You can just
speak move it?
there.
Speak loudly.
Yeah, I'll
I
just,
want to make sure that I hear you.
yeah. I'm very glad to be here, especially to talk about a book that's won the Delba Winthrop Prize, because Delba was a dear friend and colleague of mine in graduate school. And so this is a bittersweet event for me. For the sake of truth in advertising, I have to admit that unlike my colleagues on this panel, I'm not a Hume scholar. But I agreed to do this gig because the last book I wrote was about Benjamin Franklin. And I'm a friend of Benjamin Franklin. I fell in love with him. And so was Hume. And any friend of Franklin is a friend of mine. Now, I don't have to explain the details of this, but Franklin's path of thinking bears a striking resemblance to his pal, David Hume. Oh, thanks. According to Merrill, Hume's treatise is akin to an intellectual biography. His path of thinking turns out, in a way, to be a kind of picture of the path of modern philosophy. I think that's fair to say. So Hume first describes his encounter with Descartes and the way of ideas. This was, in Hume's mind, an effort to grapple with the issue of radical questioning, the hopeful human attempt to fathom the ultimate causes and principles of things. Here Hume follows Bacon on the restlessness of the human mind. It can never tarry with positive knowledge, but always wants to know the answer to Alfie's question, what's it all about? There are two paths of radical questioning that emerge in Hume and in Mr. Merrill's book. One is to know that the world we live in is characterized by absolute necessity, and so will always be exactly as it has been, and so is eternal. The other is to know that the world we live in is created from nothing by the supreme will of God. Hume begins with the first alternative, especially as it was argued by Descartes and in the way of ideas. Beginning with the immediate certainty of the impressions and ideas in the mind, we can distinguish clearly between the world as it appears in our senses and in our perceptions, and senses and perceptions, and the world as it objectively or really is. And that means matter in motion governed by absolute mathematical laws. Now, this is a kind of super shorthand for the moves that Descartes makes from the absolute certainty that his conscious mind is thinking in his famous cogito ergo sum. And this is a certainty that is immune from the tricks of any evil genius. And that genius, of course, is God. And we know who that trickster is, God. And from that certainty, he moves to the absolute certainty of those mathematical ideas that his consciousness conceives, and then from the applicability of those mathematical ideas to the laws governing extension, solidity, and motions of the material world. And for him, that turned out to be the eternal and necessary vortices of the universe. Now, those laws that supposedly describe the material universe presuppose causation, and Hume shows that presupposition to be in no way demonstrated. As Merrill puts it, Hume asserted in a Cartesian vein that whatever can be conceived, that is to say, is non-contradictory, is possible. With this argument, Hume explains anything imaginable and not contradictory is actually possible in this world. A talking pig or a man with an elephant's nose. Hume also argued that any two things that are distinct in our minds, two ideas neither of which is logically entailed by the other, may exist in total isolation from each other. This is just turning Descartes on his head. Therefore, since the ideas of cause and effect are evidently distinct, this is quoting Hume. Therefore, since the ideas of cause and effect are evidently distinct, it will be easy to conceive something not existing at one moment and then one moment later existing. without conjoining to it the distinct idea of a cause or productive principle. Now, in addition to these rather a priori arguments, Hume also showed that in our experience of cause and effect, we have no impression of, and so no cognitive access to, causal or productive power. Our experience of cause and effect is just a determination of the mind. When we see fire approach a piece of paper, we have a subsequent and vivid idea of the piece of paper igniting, together with an internal feeling and an idea of that feeling that we were determined to have that vivid idea. This feeling of determination is caused by the mind's propensity to carry our thoughts from one object to another, propelled by the passions and sustained as belief by the force of custom. Now, all these arguments amount to a refutation of the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that anything that has a beginning must have a cause. And it also violates the principle of the uniformity of nature, that nature cannot change its course in some fundamental way. So what Hume does is to take Descartes and show that all of his claims and arguments to certainty wind up in total and complete uncertainty, both as regards cause and the unity and uniformity of nature. All inquiry into nature depends on the assumptions of cause and effect and uniformity, but we have no real demonstration of these assumptions. The radical questioning of the way of ideas wants a cause for every material effect because it does not. Because it.
You did it.
Yeah, I did it. Yeah.
Evil genius did it.
This Cartesian way of ideas wants a cause for every material effect because it does not want to admit the other path of radical questioning and answering, the possibility of miracles and the divine creation of the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. And this is a quote from the treatise, page 173, which is a conclusion that Hume comes to, the possibility that anything can produce anything. But the Cartesian way of ideas, says Hume, can't get what it wants. It wants this so it doesn't have to confront the believers, it doesn't have to listen to them, but it can't have what it wants. There's yet another story to be told about radical questioning. According to Hume, says Merrill, since ancient times philosophers have adhered to the doctrine of double existence, which no matter its particular form, Plato, Aristotle, or modern science, distinguishes between the false world of the vulgar, all of us, and the real world revealed by philosophy, by philosophers. The vulgar think that the impressions in their minds are objects, and thus the objects of the world. We all think that right now when we're sitting here. I think this is right here. I'm leaning on it. The philosophers look behind that folly to the unseen reality, either above or inside or behind the objects of the world as disclosed by the impressions of the mind. The modern form of the doctrine of double existence distinguishes between primary and secondary qualities. Anybody in here who's read Locke knows about this. Distinguishes between primary and secondary qualities. Secondary qualities are sounds and colors and heat and cold and other sensible qualities. And these perceptions exist only in our heads. Primary qualities, on the other hand, are such things as extension and solidity and figure and motion and gravity and cohesion. These are the constituent real things, the stuff of mathematical physics, underlying our everyday experience. Hume argues, however, that if we throw out the bathwater of secondary qualities, we also throw out the baby of primary qualities as well. He says, if colors, sounds, tastes, and smells be merely perceptions, nothing we can conceive is possessed of a real, continued, and independent existence, not even motion, extension, and solidity, that is, the primary qualities insisted on. He asks, isn't the solidity of my desk just as much a perception as my perception of its color? We can only perceive the solid, he says, by way of seeing and feeling. How Hume is asking, can we get to the real things behind perceptions if, as perceptions, they have, quote, no resemblance to those objects? Our ideas have to resemble our impressions, but we have no way of knowing if or how those impressions resemble objects. So the philosopher's notions of natural cause and effect and the reality, however mathematical, behind the world of appearances just mirror the foolishness of the vulgar, who think the world they see in their minds is really out there. The foolish vulgar think the colors are really out there. The foolish philosophers think extension and all the aspects of matter are out there. Same mistake. So Newton could have been in the grip of an omnipotent evil genius. Moreover, the philosopher's radical questioning collapses into the faithful possibility that God made the world out of nothing and could change the course of nature by his miracles. Their own way of reason is but a consolation against the claims of faith and belief. It doesn't hold water, though. As Hume says at the end of Book 1 of the treatise, generally speaking, the errors in religion are dangerous, those in philosophy ridiculous. These awful facts drove Hume to a solipsistic and melancholy gloom that makes him solitary and an uncouth monster, unfit for normal life with normal people. He literally describes himself having gone nuts after convincing himself that the world is knowable or unknowable in the way that he has proved follows precisely from the rationalist tradition beginning with Descartes. The only way out for Hume in particular and the philosopher in general is to be aware that his opinions about such matters are just opinions, and to think about things more amenable to reason and closer to our everyday experience. And that's how Merrill's Hume proceeds. He turns from the ultimate necessities, intelligible nature, mysterious divine will, to investigate those opinions and necessities that we human beings experience in everyday life. As Dirty Harry said, a man's got to know his limitations. And if he does, he can know quite a lot. Merrill's Hume leaves the terrain of metaphysics and ultimate or sufficient cause and turns to the human things, the passions, the self, the will. As regards the self, Hume rejects Cartesian dualism, with its self understood as an immaterial consciousness that is perfectly identical and simple, and that knows itself and its thoughts directly. The self never apprehends itself directly. Hume, and at least nobody I know, has never really apprehending himself directly. This is what Kant, less spiritually than Descartes, called the transcendental unity of a perception, and which Heidegger attacks, I think, quite successfully in Being and Time, but no matter. In fact, Hume's account of the self is vaguely akin to Heidegger's account of everyday being in the world. According to Hume, the mind is just a big heap of ideas. And the self is bound up completely with the messiness and flux of embodied life and consists ultimately in the direct passions, like thirst and sexual desire and things like that, and the indirect passions, especially two, pride and its opposite, humility. The indirect passions are the preeminently self-conscious motions of the self, since they arise from our negotiations and interactions with the material world, especially as property, and with other selves, along with our emergent and changeable opinions of our powers and how we stand in the world. Our power would, if it could, make us masters of others, but we cannot really do this apart from dependence on what others think of us. To be a self is to experience a kind of projecting outside of ourselves and returning to ourselves. And this going and coming involves things, people, passions, and opinions. We cannot know metaphysically that our self is connected and continuous. I can't know absolutely that I am who I am now and that I am who I am now. Okay? That's impossible to prove. And that's what drove Hume nuts. We cannot do that. But all that said, we have to live as if we do know it. There's no alternative, and we can do just that. The alternative would be to become paralyzed or go crazy, to suffer the philosophical melancholy and delirium that Hume experienced at the height of his skeptical solipsism at the end of Book 1 of the treatise. Hume's account, I didn't hear that. Doesn't exist. Hume's account of the self discloses the source of our sense of right. Our pride in property. A person is defined, oneself is defined in large measure, Hume thinks, in the passionate relations that we have with stuff, with property. And we're proud if we have a lot of it, and we're humble if we don't, humility if we don't. So our pride in property involves a claim of right, of exclusive right in that property, which does not mean that there is such a right by nature that morally obliges others to defer to it. It's just that we can't comport toward property without having a sense of right. It's mine and you can't get into it. Nevertheless, our pride in our power is associated with that claim of right, as well as with property. If there's a right, however, there must be wrong. And for both to be moral qualities, there has to be free will and responsibility. So you can see the procession here, from the passions to property to the sense of right, and then to the moral intuitions about free will and choice and responsibility. Pride, Hume thinks, and I think Merrill shows this decisively, pride is the ultimate source of our moral intuitions. And those intuitions are subject to fantastic, extravagant, and ultimately incoherent exaggerations. Human beings are by their natures inclined to confuse two radically different notions of liberty. Liberty of spontaneity, which means the absence of external compulsion. Okay? I don't have handcuffs on my arms, so I'm free to use them. Okay? That kind of liberty. But another kind is the liberty of indifference, which means freedom from all necessities and causes. The latter, says Hume, is absurd and extravagant, since it takes the human will to be like a god, unconstrained by anything. But even so, it is indeed what we mean when we think about moral responsibility. If a good or bad deed has some cause we did not freely choose, then how indeed can we be held accountable or responsible for it? Hume says that we assert the liberty of indifference out of the proud desire to assert our specialness in the world. Pride, our specialness in the world. And paradoxically, we assert this liberty of indifference spurred by the cause of this desire. Okay? But pointing out that paradox doesn't settle the issue, since it begs the question at hand. Is there such a thing as the liberty of indifference? Actually, to refute this fantastic possibility would require the demonstration of an overarching necessity governing all the acts of all wills. Okay? And that reason cannot do. And so it cannot rule out the possibility that will, and even creation ex nihilo, is in fact the deepest reality of the whole world. Quick step from there to Friedrich Nietzsche. So how does Hume treat this matter, which was relevant to contemporary theological disputation as well, by the way? He takes it on not metaphysically, but dialectically. That is, by showing that it is contrary or contradictory on its own terms. On the one hand, we think this liberty of necessity, we think this liberty is necessary for moral responsibility. Everybody thinks that when they do something, if they do something just and it's a moral decision, that they did it freely, that they chose it, they were responsible. Not because I had a gun at my head, but because I freely chose it. So on the one hand, we think this liberty is necessary for moral responsibility. But on the other hand, that same liberty makes responsibility impossible, says Hume, since it eliminates entirely the continuity of the self. Says Hume, a thing with the liberty of indifference could not have any identity at all. And he agrees with Leibniz in saying that a God who had such a liberty would be an arbitrary moral monster. The murderer who murdered, if he were completely free in the sense of the liberty of identity, of indifference, the murderer who murdered could not be the same self who would get the punishment he could not then deserve, because he'd be something different. He could have chosen to be somebody else, okay, because he's free to do. Okay? Cosmic necessity doesn't undermine morality and religion, says Mr. Merrill's Hume. The liberty of indifference does. And by the way, you must buy this book because there are so many delicious lines in it. Merrill calls this the perfect get-out-of-jail-free card. I get out of jail. I didn't do it. My other self did it, but I'm not that guy anymore. We cannot experience our moral lives, and indeed we can't live or speak or think, Hume is saying, without regard to the necessities we experience in living life. These necessities, in other words, we can't have the liberty of indifference. If we did, we'd be nothing, so we've got to face up to the fact that we're in the grip of all these things that are moving around, our passions and our projections and our opinions and all that. And he says these necessities are not material, the operations of senseless matter. So all kinds of arguments about free will are often immediately launched off into metaphysical discussions about how does this motion in matter make us free, and how does the mind interact with the body via the pineal gland or some nonsensical stuff like that. So he doesn't take that road. The only necessity of which we have any direct experience is the necessity inherent in being human, which we use to interpret the world that surrounds us. We know the self only by and through what it or we do, and this is to be moved by the passions into that world and back to the self, along with its considered opinions about its passions and its powers. A being endowed, again, with the liberty of indifference wouldn't be a being at all, because at any moment it would be something new. This fantastic liberty is the elevation of liberty, of spontaneity, to fantastic metaphysical heights. And it's the self-destruction of the pride that in large part makes us who we are. I mean, if in fact our pride makes us who we are, and we blow that pride up into this exaggerated sense of our freedom, we become nothing. For Hume, human reason can only be in service to the passions that push us in and through the world. And even our thinking consists largely of interactions of ideas and passions. This does not lead Hume to a simple relativism, however, according to Mr. Merrill, because there are two kinds of passions. Violent ones, in addition to the direct and indirect, there are violent and calm passions. And the good life can be discerned as self-mastery and strength of mind, in which the mild passions predominate in the self. You can get a hold of yourself, Hume says. You can become master of yourself in some way. As Merrill puts it, the violent passion is a bit like a child having a temper tantrum about things he cannot change. So it should come as no surprise that when Hume turns in Book 3 of the treatise to matters of morality and politics, he also treats them in terms of the passions and prudence. The basic question for Hume is the status of justice and the other moral virtues. Are they natural or artificial? He dispatches the issue of justice straight away. Even though justice is the exemplary moral virtue because it harbors the tension between its requirements, and the good of society and ourselves, Hume can find no plausible natural motive, a natural impulse in our bosoms for it. And absent that natural motive, there's no natural law or moral obligation by nature, and justice is artificial. It is, he says. But that doesn't make it arbitrary. It's not arbitrary because given nature's stinginess and human cupidity, it arises artificially in order to secure our lives and property. Justice is intelligent self-interest, but Hume finds no problem here because even if we don't adhere to justice for its own sake, the problem solved by justice is its adequate reason for being. Since there's no natural right, there's likewise no natural right to rule, and government is strictly instrumental for Hume. No one has a right to rule because of who or what she is, whether wise, pious, or virtuous. Although a prudent man respects established claims that work as the reasonable consensus of opinion in society. And given these basic principles, there's for Hume a right, if you can call it that, to resist tyranny when the bargain that is political society is no longer a bargain. So even now comes some tricky moves on Hume's part with which I will wrap up. If justice is artificial and rational self-interest, Hume asks why we admire it even when we see it in one who returns a loan to somebody who uses the money to buy a gun to shoot us. This can be explained only by the passion of sympathy. Human beings, says Merrill's Hume, just can't help putting themselves in other people's shoes. That's how we're impossible gossips. We can't resist it. So we just can't help putting ourselves in other people's shoes, and there are, says Hume, genuine excellences that are worthy of having for their own sake. Greatness of mind and benevolence and goodness being among the most admired. On the one hand, such virtues as courage, intrepidity, ambition, and love of glory, and, okay, he's not telling me to shut up. On the one hand, such virtues as courage, intrepidity, ambition, and love of glory, and magnanimity, and benevolence all involve self-esteem and pleasure. But on the other hand, they often involve self-sacrifice, often the ultimate self-sacrifice and complete ruin. Even so, says Hume, we think such sacrifice makes the great and the benevolent more fully realized souls than the average bloke. To explain this, Hume says that unlike moralists who distinguish between mere natural abilities and moral virtues accompanied by free will and responsibility, everyday ordinary opinion admires natural abilities as much as moral virtues, such as justice in the case of the man who lent the money, paid it back, and got shot for it. We admire both him, that man, and we admire sports stars and supermodels. Okay? So both natural abilities and moral virtue produce pleasure and love of esteem, and love and esteem. Fair enough. But then Hume says something a bit surprising. He just says that the moral virtues are actually natural abilities. Greatness and goodness, whatever sacrifice may be involved, are natural passions of the great and the good. They are just who these people are, and they can't be held responsible for it. He even says in this vein that men in common life admire natural abilities, the moral ones included, without worrying about the voluntary and the involuntary. Moreover, he says, all moralists not under the spell of some theoretical system like modern philosophy are just like the ancients who placed prudence as the head of the cardinal virtues. Prudence, according to Hume, trumps greatness and goodness. That said, Hume then again maintains that we admire the good and the great not because they sacrifice themselves, sometimes ultimately, for someone else's good, but rather because they express fully our own good and our own natures. Now, in all of this back and forth, it seems to me that Mr. Merrill here smells a self-protective fudge on Hume's part. We've got two contradictory claims here. We think self-sacrifice makes the great and the benevolent more fully realized souls than us, clods. But then we don't think they are more fully realized because of that sacrifice. That's what he says. But just because they do great and good deeds. To say the least, I think this contradiction suggests a profound and deep contradiction in our everyday attitude toward moral self-sacrifice. We think it's good for the person who sacrifices, and that it's not good for the person who sacrifices, although it always turns out on this argument that it's good for those who are neither fully good or fully great. Moreover, this argument goes well beyond the dialectical argument against the liberty of indifference, which turned on that liberty's obliteration of moral responsibility and punishment and reward. That argument presumed the coherence of our normal intuitions about moral virtue and responsibility. This argument looks very much like a critique of that responsibility. We don't choose our natural and moral passions, even if they are crucial to our happiness. That means that happiness is never deserved. As Merrill says, and close to the end, it's just plain luck. Moreover, if great and even ultimate sacrifice fully express who we are, as Hume claims and then doubts, it's a very big deal for him to say that prudence is the cardinal virtue. It's an equally big thing for Mr. Merrill to say that Hume implies that prudence is the judge of the natural abilities or passions, and that would include goodness and greatness and great sacrifice and all of that. So it's also a big deal for him to say that Hume implies that prudence is the judge of the natural abilities and passions, and that prudence in the best case determines how far to indulge them. Well, it occurred to me at this point that the passion for ultimate and great sacrifice is a violent passion, not a mild one. And prudence tells us that a violent passion is like the tantrum of a child. In the same vein, even if Hume is right, as I think he is, that the liberty of indifference is incoherent, he is wrong to say that men in common life don't really care about it. As crazy as the liberty of indifference may be, it is precisely what normal people assume about everyday moral choice. No wonder the moralist Hutcheson screwed Hume in the matter of a university position. So, Merrill's Hume thinks radical questioning is what makes human beings so often right out of their minds. It's the wellspring of religion as well as the wellspring of philosophy, both of which are tempted to find these ultimate and sufficient causes of things. Modern philosophy fools itself into thinking it can fathom the ultimate laws of nature which the vulgar can't see, but only by a move no different from the follies of the vulgar. And that move is but one step away from disclosing the mystery of divine creation of the world ex nihilo. It's no wonder then that philosophy and faith engage in a kind of deranged historical tango, especially when that faith is Christianity. Merrill's Hume takes on that question and many others about politics and partisanship in the essays, and that's Mr. Scott's territory, and I'll turn it over to him as we agree.
I'll warn you, I don't have a phrase as good as deranged historical tango, but maybe as I speak, something will come to mind. Mazurka or something like that, perhaps. Thank you. So I was lucky to have been asked to review Tom Merrill's book for Cambridge, and now I'm about to tell a joke that Alan already told me. I'm going to tell it again. The blurb they put on the back cover begins, quote, "Merrill has written a book that should have been written long ago," end quote. Last night at dinner, Alan told me that his wife, Jackie, had been telling Tom that for a long time. I just want to be clear that I didn't mean that in the blurb. Okay? I want to thank Alan for inviting me to this conference to celebrate the publication of Tom's fine book. I followed the creation and building of the political theory community here, the Political Theory Institute, for some years now, and have been impressed by the quality and vitality of the various programs here, the talks, the conferences, and other events, including this one here at American University. But most of all, I've been impressed by the people involved in this political theory community, including Alan and Tom and their colleagues and the other people who are involved. I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and thank you again for inviting me. I first met Tom in 2003, I believe, on the recommendation of Ruth Grant, his dissertation advisor at Duke. She told me about a student of hers who was completing an excellent thesis on David Hume. I met Tom shortly after Ruth told me this while I was in D.C., where he was living while working at the American Enterprise Institute. And in fact, the reason I was in D.C., if I recall correctly, was I was giving a talk at American University, undoubtedly at the birth of the Political Theory Institute. I remember liking Tom a lot and thinking he was bright and eager. What I particularly remember about our conversation that day was a discussion of Tom's claim in his dissertation that Hume was not, in fact, an opponent of natural rights doctrines and contract theory, at least in the sense that he's usually thought of that. So it was with no little deja vu that I read a version of Tom's argument toward the end of his book. By the way, I didn't just mention the passage of 13 years merely to note that Tom's book should have been written a long time ago. Tom's book on Hume and the politics of Enlightenment is a truly impressive work of scholarship. And to get a sense of the depth and the scope, I think it's useful to begin with a brief account of Hume's writings and the scholarship on those writings, especially for those of you who are less versed in these extremely important matters, not to say fascinating matters, to scholars, students, family, and friends, and folks, as Obama likes to say, that people like Tom and I have the great fortune to sit next to in a plane or at a bar. Hume is the best known today as a philosopher and for his early treatise on human nature in particular. This reputation is somewhat ironic, given that the treatise by the 28-year-old Hume was initially a failure. As the author famously said, it fell, quote, stillborn from the press. And in fact, Hume himself later all but repudiated his maiden work, though not for the substance of his arguments, but rather for his manner of presenting them. Now, by the way, maiden work is Tom's coinage, as far as I can tell, after quoting Hume saying he castrated his work for publication. I thought that was nice. I hope that was an intentional, I'm making it my own. Nonetheless, Hume, despite this sort of the failure of the treatise and Hume's repudiation of it, or quasi-repudiation, today Hume is primarily found in philosophy departments where scholars study the treatise and only deign to teach his later representation of his thought in the inquiries, especially the one on human understanding, because their poor undergraduates are not ready to digest these meatier treatises. A further irony. In his own time, Hume was primarily known not for the treatise, except among a sort of small group of experts or fellow travelers. He was not known for his treatise, much less for the enquiries, but rather for the much more successful essays and then the history of England. Hume's 18th century reputation is encapsulated by the fact that he's listed in the card catalog of the British Museum, which opened during his lifetime, not as a philosopher, but as an historian. Despite his reputation during his lifetime, or perhaps because of it, contemporary scholars all but ignore the essays and the history of England, as I suppose irrelevant for understanding Hume's philosophy, and especially the epistemological issues with which scholars are almost entirely uniformly concerned, not to say obsessed. Indeed, based on conversations I've had with some of these philosophers, I'd say that they view the essays and histories beneath Hume's dignity and therefore beneath their notice. Okay. Tom not only doesn't ignore the essays in his work or the history, although that work he merely drops hints about what he might do with it, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But Tom makes Hume's essays on subjects moral, political, and economic in particular the centerpiece of his argument about Hume's Enlightenment politics. Yet, far from ignoring the treatise, Tom links the treatise and the essays together in his interpretation and shows that the philosophical concerns and the project of the treatise continues in the essays. Tom, therefore, not only gives a sustained treatment of the generally overlooked and underappreciated essays, but he does so after giving a remarkably fresh interpretation of the much interpreted treatise. So I think that this is really the hallmark of his work. He takes up in the first half of his book an extended interpretation of Hume's famous treatise and his argument about the Socratic turn that Hume does in the treatise in a way that's very fresh and is a very crowded bookshelf of works on the treatise. So to do with a fresh interpretation of this scope and this depth of the treatise is impressive. To then link it to a sustained interpretation of Hume's essays as a continuation of the project of the treatise is unparalleled. Since Jerry's focused his remarks on Tom's discussion of the treatise, I'll focus mine on his interpretation of the essays now. As the title essays Incidentally, I say that, as Tom remarks, that Hume published the treatise in the late 1730s, 3 volumes of it, and then immediately after its failure turned to writing essay writings, the first volume of which was 1741, expanded in 1742, later in 1748 and 1752, if I've got my dates right. So during that next decade plus, after his writing the treatises, Hume was involved in writing the essays as well as writing the popularizations, let's call it, of the treatise as well. So Tom puts, they're contiguous in time, and I think that Tom's right in seeing that they're a continuation of the project, even if other people have not noticed it before. Okay, so as the title Essays might suggest, and as tradition of essay writing from Montaigne and Bacon might attest, at least at first blush, essays are generally brief treatments of a subject with a relatively open or casual form, at least on the surface, at any rate. So, for example, from Montaigne, we get essays on moderation, or on experience, or my favorite, on thumbs. Yeah, he was an early proponent of the thumbs up. It's a little known fact about Montaigne. Now, Hume's essays treat a number of subjects as well, but they're more generally focused on political and economic subjects, although there are other subjects on more philosophic and aesthetic issues as well. And I want to come back to that as well. Okay? So Tom argues in the second half of his book that there's a plan, development, and conscious aim or intention in Hume's essays. And I'm unaware of anyone who's made this case, much less made it as persuasively as Tom does. Tom's central thesis is that the essays contain Hume's continued project of reorienting philosophy and making it safe for society. A project that he argues earlier in his book, Tom's book, that Hume began in the treatise. So again, it's a continuation of the critique of philosophy, the reformation of philosophy, in order to make it safe for philosophy itself, as well as useful for society. In short, philosophy must be unmoored from its doctrinal tendencies, which Jerry remarked on, and especially those doctrinal tendencies as they are inflamed by Christianity and a kind of unrecognized union between philosophy and theology that Hume is eager to tear asunder. Instead, philosophy must recognize, its limits, and make others who look to it for absolute knowledge and guidance also recognize the limits of philosophy. Philosophers themselves must recognize the limits of their task, and other people who look to philosophy must recognize those limits as well if philosophy is going to be safe for itself and for others. Rather, philosophy must be anchored in common life, to point to Hume's phrase, and it must offer moderating guidance to us in our moral and political lives, hence the emphasis on prudence that Jerry remarked on. This is the core of what Tom terms Hume's politics of enlightenment. Tom traces the development of this project in the essays, again, continuing the project of the treatise. He beginning with Hume's early essays in the work on political science, and especially a political science that's inspired in interesting ways by Machiavelli, though also corrected by Hume and placed within a vision of constitutional politics that builds on and also reforms British political experience. So a creative appropriation of Machiavellian themes in Hume's own political science and an application to the British scene by Hume. Tom then pursues this project, as does Hume, by looking at Hume's vision of a commercial republic and its consequences, largely unintended. And I thought that was an interesting argument I would have liked to see more of, is the sort of doctrine of unintended consequences in Hume's consideration of politics. So Hume's vision of a commercial republic and its consequences, largely unintended, of taming politics and making it more concerned with individual rights and the rule of law, and then concluding with Hume's critical examination of the theory and practice of British politics over the previous half century or more. And this is where I think picking up the history of England would be interesting as well. Okay? So Tom traces Hume's project of enlightening politics through the essays and particularly through the political and economic vision that Hume has that, again, is meant to make philosophy useful for politics as a moderating prudential force rather than dangerous as it tends to be in the form of ideology, particularly when ideology is wed with a religious, is animated by religion, I guess I'll say. Okay, as I said before, I know of no other scholar who's given this kind of sustained treatment to the essays or made such a strong and I think largely persuasive case for their coherence. Okay, let me conclude by asking Tom a couple of questions which he may or may not address here tonight, but I'm sure we'll carry on a conversation tonight and I hope over the next years. Why did I say that Tom's case for the essays and their coherence is largely persuasive? Okay. Let me add a challenge to Tom on this question of the essays and ask him a couple of other things as well. Okay. Again, I was impressed by Tom's sustained treatment of the essays, but if I were to quibble with that sustained treatment, I would say there was a little picking and choosing going on. So how many of the essays fit the interpretation that Tom would have of them? So as Tom remarks, he has 2 chapters on the essays in his book. The first chapter is on the first part of Hume's essays. The second chapter on the second part of the essays being divided into these 2 parts. Tom's consideration of the second part of the essays, which is largely on commercial topics and on the British political scene, is pretty comprehensive. He deals with most of the essays in that set in the second part. But I must note his first part, his discussion of first part's a little more pick and choose. Okay? So to what degree do the essays as a whole follow the line of interpretation of a politics of enlightenment? Let me give you one example, and I'll point the case to make it clear. Tom begins with Hume's essay on that politics may be reduced to a science, I believe, but that's not where Hume begins. Hume begins in the first essay in his collection with the delicacy of taste. So how does the essay on the delicacy of taste or other essays, for example, on aesthetic or literary subjects, relate to Hume's project of enlightenment? Now, I think it's terrific that Tom has done what he's done with this, but I just wonder how far one can push the coherence of Hume's essays as a whole. Okay? Now, perhaps Hume hid, and Tom hid along with Hume, the thread of his politics of enlightenment behind this facade of literary essays. I don't know what the answer is, but I'd be curious to hear. Okay? Let me pick up Tom's own invitation in his work to ask about how the history of England fits into this project and Tom's project. Now, I think, again, given the long time of gestation and of this work, it would be too much to ask Tom to have written a further chapters, or perhaps 6 chapters on the history of England. For those of you who don't know, again, it was the history of England that made Hume a rich and famous man. And Hume wrote 6 volumes of the history of England, from the invasion of Julius Caesar to the Glorious Revolution. And he wrote them in reverse order, thus bringing people to accuse him of, like a witch, speaking reverse order. So the devilish Hume, in his history of England, has a project too. And Tom, at a certain couple points, throws off some hints, I think, about how the history of England would fit into his interpretation of Hume in general. And I'd love to see more of that, and perhaps that's where you're going to turn next in your projects, but I would just giving you an invitation to speak to that subject. I also have a question on the doctrine of double existence, but I'll put that off until later. So thank you very much for inviting me.
So the only appropriate thing to say, or the appropriate emotion to have at this point, is gratitude. To say thank you, first of all, to all of you for coming. It's a big deal, and there are many friends from different areas of my life. My mother's here, my wife is here, longtime friends, colleagues, former students, came back to see me. Current students are here, and that means a lot to me. It's in some ways, it doesn't get better than this, to have all of you in the room with me. And I also want to thank a couple of other people. I want to thank Alan Levine, who is really the, I think his title is Founding Director of Political Theory Institute. And you have to remember Political Theory Institute right now is a pretty flourishing thing. We've got lots of students, we've got lots of external funding, we bring in speakers, all this kind of stuff. But there were many years when it was Alan by himself trying to hold everything together with shoestrings. And I have to say that none of us would be sitting in this room, and I personally would not be in this room if it weren't for Alan. Alan's tenacity and his intelligence in trying to keep this whole project going. So I just think it's really important for us to give Alan a round of applause. He's the person who's responsible. I also want to thank my panelists, Jerry and John. That it's a real honor to be on a panel with them. I wrote this book. For some reason, John kept reminding me of how long it took me to write this book, and there's a lot of thinking that was going on there. But at the time when I was actually putting the words down on the page, I was sitting in the library just a few steps from here, and the process of writing is a long and a hard one, and often a lonely one. And there are times in which a person starts to lose confidence or a certain sense of what direction, where to go. And I have to say that it was the work of Jerry and John, who both who I wasn't talking to or in conversation with at that time, that really showed me that this kind of work could be done. And I think of Jerry's work in particular, so Jerry's work on Bacon and his work on Franklin showed me that you could treat modern thinkers not just as propagandists who had a particular plan for reforming the world, but also as thinkers. And maybe the most important thing about them was their thought about what the world is, that they really are philosophers and not just sort of quasi-Marxist people trying to take over the world. And I was trying to think of a good word to describe. Jerry's book on Franklin is really brilliant and funny, but the word that really comes to mind, I'm trying to say this in a polite way, ribald, I suppose, would be one way of saying it. Yes. Or how about Aristophanic? Is that a polite enough word? You students, you can look it up and figure out what it means. When I was in college, I had a professor who told us about all the naughty bits in Franklin. And you students may not know this, but some founding fathers liked dirty jokes. Franklin was one of them. And I had a professor who told us about those parts and said, I'm not going to tell you where they are in Franklin's collected works. You'll have to look it up yourself. So in a similar tone, I will not tell you where the ribald parts or the Aristophanic parts are of Jerry's book. I will leave them for you to discover for yourself. As for John, I think of John as really, Alan mentioned the number of articles that John has published, and it really is kind of a stunning fact for those of us who are in the racket, as we say, that John Scott is really the consummate craftsman of political theory, to my mind. That he's the person who's mastered the art of the academic essay more than anyone else that I know. And I know that he's mastered the art because he's able to teach it. He has many students who have also been able to publish in top journals, in excellent places, with work that is really deep and philosophical and interesting. And that's something that I think one definitely ought not to look down on. There are many other graduate programs when I speak to students that I think are flashier or may have a higher profile, but I think when historians look back at this time of political theory, they're going to say there are a lot of articles that were published by people who have University of California at Davis connections, right? So I think that's something that I admire John for. I admire it so much that I actually assigned his article in my class. This is the Patricide and the Plot of the Prince article, a classic from the 90s. Many of my students will remember it, and I assign it not because of the substance of the argument, which it's really a fantastic article, but because we're trying to learn about the nuts and bolts of what does it mean to actually write an article. And to me, that article really signals that in a particularly vivid way. Now it happens that many of those students after that class also try to kill me, which may have something to do with the theme of the class. I'm not sure what you're teaching out there. But I really admire both of these guys tremendously, and I'm just really glad that they were here to be able to talk about the book. I want to say a little bit. I'm not sure if I have very many specific responses to the questions. I just want to say what they've gotten their chance to say what they thought was important about the book. I want to say a little bit about what I thought was important about the book, and I also want to leave time for questions from you guys. This is a book that's really about radical questioning, about the kind of questioning where you're led to think about ultimate things, about what the truth about causality is, that ultimately leads us to confront questions about, is there an ultimate necessity in the world, is there a God, things like that. But it's also a book that's about the tension between that kind of questioning, which I think can make us go a little bit insane, as Jerry mentioned. The tension between radical questioning and practical life. That's the thing that I think Hume is really grappling with, and that's the thing that I'm trying to grapple with in the book too. Hume famously explores this question in a strange but very well-known autobiographical passage at the end of Book 1 of the treatise. Some of you who know me know this very well. That's the conclusion of part 1. He shows us there that radical questioning leads him to what he calls philosophical melancholy and delirium, which is a great phrase that did not get used enough, gentlemen. He tells us that he turned away from radical questioning. In that passage, he tells us that he turned away from radical questioning to a more down-to-earth, practically oriented mode of being in the world. Most scholars read this as a Richard Rorty-like abandonment of radical questioning, that people just give up in the end. Hume gives up and he basically becomes a pragmatist and he says, don't do any of that highfalutin philosophy stuff, it's just stupid. But that's not what Hume actually says. It's hard to see how Hume could just magically forget about all those questions that have been driving him crazy, and lots of evidence that he really doesn't. What he really does is show us that before one can reasonably approach all those metaphysical or theological issues that bother him so much, there's a question or a set of questions that have to be addressed first, as the sine qua non of thinking about any other question. This is the question of self-knowledge, which in turn requires taking seriously moral and political matters on their own terms, and that he symbolizes dramatically by talking about this relationship between the philosophers and the honest gentleman. And he says the philosophers have to learn from the honest gentleman. He says that we have to take moral and political matters seriously on their own terms without imposing any theoretical framework or interpretation from the outside. He in effect says that in order to really be a philosopher, that is to be a fully self-conscious philosopher, one must first be a political philosopher, someone who tries to understand him or herself by means of understanding the whole human phenomenon with all of its tragedy and comedy. Some of you will already hear in what I've just said echoes of Socrates' famous turn away from natural philosophy or metaphysics to studying the human things, which means especially moral and political things. And you would be right. So one of the novelties of my book, the selling points, I'm not sure if everyone bought it, but this is what I'm staking my claim on. I claim that Hume, in some sense, modeled his account of philosophy in the treatise on the well-known Socratic turn, the well-known Socratic story of how Socrates became who he was. And I have evidence for this. In the introduction to the treatise, Hume makes an enigmatic and often misunderstood reference to Socrates that boils down to this. I, Hume, will do for modern science and philosophy, meaning Bacon and Descartes, what Socrates did for ancient science and philosophy. To forestall misunderstandings, I should say I don't think that Hume was really a very close reader of Plato. Nor is it clear on its face what Hume thought was actually involved in the Socratic turns. I don't think there's some sort of like secret tradition that's passed down. I basically think that he sort of worked out what he thought it meant to be a philosopher, and then he saw this story that I can sort of hang my hat on, explain it to people in terms of this famous story. I suspect that Hume is thinking of a line from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, well known to the 18th century, but not so well known to most Hume scholars in the 20th, which is what allowed me to discover it. Socrates, Cicero says, was the first philosopher to call philosophy down from the heavens and establish it in the cities, and to compel it to investigate life and morality and good and evil. I think that Hume sees himself in that line, and in a sense, it conveys the heart of what Hume wants to say about philosophy in the Treatise of Human Nature. More than that, I show in the book that Hume's allusion to Socrates, and I think this is really the payoff, the value added of making that particular connection, helps unlock the structure of the treatise itself. So Book 1 corresponds to what you might call Hume's pre-Socratic stage, that is his grappling with the best scientific account of the world that he knows, the Cartesian project of mathematical physics. But that project has a deep puzzle or unanswered question within it, which leads to his crisis at the end of Book 1, that I mentioned a second ago. But that crisis is also a new beginning, because Hume now comes to see that philosophy can't start by asking about the first cause or nature simply. It has to start by trying to understand human beings, which means understanding morality and politics. It's only at this point, and I think this is one thing that I'm different from a lot of other interpreters on, that Hume's own project, which he sometimes calls a science of human nature, and sometimes calls political science, comes into its own. And then books 2 and 3 work this new project out. Book 2 by investigating the passions, book 3 by exploring virtue, morality, and politics. And that's a lot of what Jerry talked about. I should say I wasn't the first person to pick up on Hume's strange reference to Socrates, or even the first person to recognize that Hume is comparing himself to Socrates in a way that has to be important for Hume's own argument. John Danford deserves the credit for that. But I do think that I went the furthest in trying to explain in detail what that means for how the argument unfolds in the treatise. Perhaps I should just leave it there. That's the core of the claim that's in the book. In the last 2 chapters, I basically show how Hume is working out an argument about the relationship between radical questioning and politics that is a kind of restatement of what he does in the treatise, but I think it repeats what's in the treatise, but every repetition is not simply a restatement, that he actually goes deeper and he says more things, and it's more concrete. There are more sort of historical examples to think about. But that the essays are, in a way, his reflection on why the treatise failed and what you would have to do in order to make it more successful. So and perhaps I'll just stop right there, because I think people should ask questions, and we can continue the conversation from there. Thanks very much.
So it is our custom to allow students to ask the first questions. Yes.
So I'm wondering about this idea of the freedom of spontaneity
Right.
that is often confused, as you said. And so I'm wondering if that's exactly what governments have been set out to control all along, or really any institution, because that is a scary thought when you want order. So how would Hume answer that kind of idea? And moreover, is that a major product of his being from Britain, as opposed to how would someone who's been controlled their whole life in a more severe way than Hume was as being a rich person, as you said?
So I think when we're talking about liberty of indifference, I don't think we're talking about the political problem of how to civilize people to get them to not beating up the guy next to them. I think that the liberty of indifference is sort of a metaphysical concept that our wills are not caused by anything before them. And I think that Hume says you can't really imagine what that would look like in the real life if we were completely uncaused. And so he talks about it and he gives a critique of it. He sort of tries to show that that's incoherent with what we think about morality. On the one hand, we have to think we're completely responsible, but on the other hand, that would make us unintelligible. That's the basic. In the book, and this is sort of a somewhat controversial or more speculative, I think he's really grappling with the problem of Christianity there. I think Christianity is the thing that says there is this omnipotent being whose will is completely untrammeled by necessity, that in some ways we've inherited that, and that allows us to be morally responsible people. So Jerry didn't quite say this in his comments, but that's there, is that I think it's a implicit critique of Christianity. Yeah.
Well, it was could I jump in?
Yeah, please.
There was a huge debate within Christianity, too, a theological debate about
Right.
whether God is in thrall to reason or not. And the Jesuits tend to think yes, and the enthusiasts tend to think no. And Hume called Catholicism superstition, and he called Protestantism enthusiasm. So it was a big deal, this issue.
Yeah.
In fact, one could say that it hasn't been settled properly yet in the Islamic world either.
I just want to interrupt the train of thought for a second while we're taking the student questions and have the students' attention. That the last event, actually, of the Political Theory Institute year is an essay contest, and which is, when's the deadline?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. No, is it really tomorrow?
I think the official deadline is tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll accept them to the beginning of next week, I think. because I'm not reading them over the weekend. But we offer.
Alan, don't give away our secrets.
Yeah,
Deadlines are firm.
tomorrow. But we have a $500 prize for the best essay related to classical liberalism.
Payable in copies of my book.
So sorry, so
Sorry,
back to
yes,
to
that's
your
right.
questions.
Let's just go straight to Jeff.
You talked about Hume bringing philosophy down to earth and I believe sort of uniting theory and practice or keeping them related. And I was wondering, did he have a tremendous influence on the founding people like Madison and Jefferson?
Yeah.
Because of that, maybe greater than Locke or others?
Did I pay you money to ask this question? Yeah, so there's no question. So, I mean, everyone in Government 101 reads Madison's Federalist 10, and we have, good evidence that while Madison is drafting the argument of Federalist 10, he has Hume's essay on idea of a perpetual commonwealth or perfect commonwealth next to him. And so, there's no question that Hume's constitutional thought is a big deal for Madison and for Hamilton and for other members of the founding generation. I mean, there's a famous article by, I think it was Lutz, who did this sort of numerical study of how often things are cited. And I think because people were fighting about Locke, but it turns out that Montesquieu and Hume were right at the top. So.
How about Jefferson? I think Jerry had a reference to happiness controlling the passions.
This is great. These are all the things that I didn't write about. Jefferson goes on his campaign. Jefferson hates Hume, and he, in his later years, after 1800, he writes there are like a dozen letters in which he says things like, "Hume has done more to undermine liberty in Europe than all of Napoleon's troops." So, and there's a story to be told about why Jefferson hates him so much, but the easy answer is that he associates him with Hamilton. And it's sort of a proxy of attacking Hamilton. Yeah.
And also, Thomas Jefferson was a moral fanatic, and Hume was not.
That's the sufficient explanation. Yes.
He's also a Francophile.
Right. Alex.
I'm just curious about a remark you made maybe in passing about you not being a very close reader of Plato. Is there anything in particular in Plato you think if he'd investigated further, would have led him to qualify his opinion?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I guess I just was. I didn't want to make because I don't think the evidence bears the claim that Hume somehow was a secret Platonist, which is there's all kinds of things that contradict that. Now we do know, and we have in his early memoranda. John, do you remember this? He's got notes on Plato's laws. And he's got so Plato has a famous discussion of like the different kinds of atheists, right? There's some who don't believe in anything, and there's some people who believe that the gods actually do what you want when you sacrifice to them. Those are the people we call the religious atheists. But so he does have notes on it, but to my knowledge, there's no notes on when Socrates talks about his turn or anything like that. And the more obvious thing would be that he's referring to this line from Cicero that everybody in the 18th century knows, right? I mean, it's sort of like a trope that I'm going to bring philosophy into the coffee shops, right? So he's not that far out of the mainstream. I am in saying that, but he's not. Yeah. Martin Zitta, is that a question?
Well, I guess I'll direct this to Jerry and John. As Tom's close friend and colleague, really I'm interested in knowing what he got wrong. So is there any more direct critique you'd like to make of Tom's book that will allow me to bring
Friends like
something
these.
over
Well,
and over and over.
I can dodge this question a little bit, perhaps more easily than my colleague. I'm not a Hume scholar, so I know Hume, but I don't know him as a Hume scholar would know Hume. I think, but if I had one problem that I would, it's not a critique, but I think there's a problem looming, hovering over the head of Mr. Hume, and it's really the problem of miracles. because miracles, because he hasn't, as powerful as his arguments are about the limitations of reason, and as much as I think that Hume, now you'll have to correct me, he was an atheist, and I think I've heard you say that on the radio or on.
Only in private, Jerry, only in
No,
private.
no, it was at Cato, I think. Yeah, was he an atheist? And you said yes. And I think he was, but he doesn't have a very good argument to support his atheism. We were talking earlier that I recently read his essay on miracles, and it's absolutely extraordinary because it has this. First of all, the whole argument from the beginning to the end is subverted by his arguments in the treatise. You know, it's all this, you know, well, they're all liars, and, you know, everybody who relates miracles is a liar, and blah, 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 and they violate all the laws of cause and effect, you know, and moreover, you can't know, there's a progression of lying that goes on and all that. But then at the very end of this essay, it's really extraordinary. He basically says effectively that there's one miracle that he can't make fun of, and that's not a rock splitting and spouting water, but the sense that the Spirit of the Lord is moving with you. And he says if that happens, a miracle has occurred that just disrupts your brain altogether. That sounds like a miracle to me. So I'm not. That bothers me. That there's still a step to go to establish an argument on Hume's part. This is why I'm not a believer, because it's true that although the errors of religion are dangerous, the errors of philosophy are ridiculous, and you can't change ridiculousness, but you can take care of things that are dangerous. So I don't know why. I mean, that's just my perplexity. But I think this book is wonderful. I really do. I think it's wonderful. And if I have a second at the end, I'll read you something that is worth the price of admission. Go ahead.
I'm not a Hume scholar either. I just play one on TV. So I'll also dodge the question. I'll say one thing I wondered. Well, first of all, I raised the issue about how, to what degree Hume's essays are as coherent and consistent, or have I wouldn't say a single purpose, but an overriding purpose, given the essays that Tom ignores. So I would say that. But let me add one more thing, and I alluded to this about the doctrine of double existence. Again, to repeat that, the idea that somehow the world that the vulgar take to be the real world, the world of smells and colors and so on, is not real. That's our perception. But there's a real world somehow behind or above or something like this that the philosophers or scientists know. So the world of scientists is not colors, but rather of matter and motion, for example. But then Hume subverting that kind of claim. I guess what I would have been interested to see in Tom's interpretation of Hume, and maybe he was trying to narrow his claims in a certain way, is generally speaking, Tom takes Hume's target there to be Descartes. But I wonder whether it isn't a much broader target, especially just to keep on a local, temporally, spatial terms, Locke. For example, it seems to me that many of Locke's arguments, and Jerry sort of alluded to this, would be susceptible to the same objections on Hume's part as to Descartes. Not to mention Aristotle and Plato and so on. So what I would be curious to have seen Tom do, just was more of an expansion, not something that I think he got wrong, but more as an expansion, is if this is true, and just to take a vulgar person like myself, you can convince me that the world I take to be real, like the color of this paper, is not in fact the real world by just turning off the lights. So ordinary people can very quickly be led can be shown that the world that they sort of naively take to be the real world can't be the entire story. If that's true, and then I take Hume to be arguing that's a fact of human existence, that vulgar people and philosophers in their own way are prone to create an apparent world and a real world, and I'm jumping to Nietzsche here, right, an apparent world and a real world. If that's true, then I wonder whether that doesn't explain Hume's treatment of religion in particular. In other words, religion is a perpetual human problem because of a sort of bare epistemological issue, and that that's Hume's big target, whether or not the Descartes is a more narrow target. So I would have liked seen bigger fish, in that regard.
I agree with you, but I think that Hume makes a very repeated effort to show that the vulgar and the philosophers are really mirror images of
Yeah.
each other in the moves that they make. So this cuts both ways.
Yeah.
That's up.
So
Somebody-
I want to take advantage of my role as a moderator here to facilitate a conversation up here. And so Tom, I want to pose 3 questions to you that I heard coming from our panelists.
Do I get to write these down?
Here they are.
Okay.
So first, just for what John was talking about, the cherry picking of the essays.
Yeah.
Second, John's question about the history of England. And third, at the end of Jerry's presentation, he used the phrase, and I wasn't sure if you were quoting Hume or Tom, or it was your phrase, of genuine excellences in human nature that are somehow left over after all of the skepticism.
That's right.
And I'd like to hear on what basis Hume can think that there is some actual genuine excellence after all that skepticism.
Okay, so 3 questions. Cherry picking the essays, and you raised Delicacy of the Passions, which is a beautiful essay. I mean, I think, I guess the way that I see this is not contradictory. I don't think that the essays that every essay has got a specific step in the argument that he's making. I think that he covers it with stuff that is sort of nice, and that, and I don't think that essay is just nice. I mean, I think there's actually a hardcore kind of thing that's going on there. But I don't think that the argument about the essays having an argumentative structure means that every essay has to fit into that, right? And there are lots of other essays that you could have picked on. I mean, I do think that essay in particular, I mean, so all Hume scholars know that Hume is part of the culture of politeness, right? But politeness means that you wear clothes and you say nice things, and you don't use inappropriate words. Use words like Aristophanic instead of other things, right? But then you have to ask, well, what's being covered up? And I think what's being covered up under the culture of politeness is Machiavelli. And I think that's pretty clear in the way that Hume sets out the essays. You've got this polite essay, and then you've got the essay that says, got a great political science, but the source is Machiavelli, right? I mean, my way of describing the essays is Machiavelli for women, right? That's what he says in the essay on history writing, right? It's somehow you're bringing this message to a wider audience, to a wider reading audience. Better living through Machiavelli. So that's the answer to that. So I grant that I cherry picked the essays, but I don't think it's a fatal objection. As for the history of England, this is obviously a big kettle of fish. I would say the history of England is working out the argument that he sees that we see in the essay about Christianity, that the political problem from Hume's point of view of early modern Europe is the problem of Christianity and the problem of overcoming the Pope in a certain sense. And I think that if you see that as the thread that he's sort of working out this is also Machiavellian, that's closely related to things that you've written. I think that's the thread of the history, right? And so a lot more that could be said about that, but that's the intellectual substructure of what's going on in the different stages. Okay? So as for genuine excellences, I'm not so sure that I think that it's a problem to say that to raise the possibility of genuine excellences. I would say Hume doesn't think that there's some kind of categorical moral obligation out there in the world. But he does think that we distinguish between people who are more praiseworthy versus less praiseworthy. And I think that he thinks that there is, I mean, it's not some sort of metaphysical basis, but it is an empirical experience that we admire people who do great deeds more than we admire the couch potato who sits at home. And that in a certain sense, the more that we think about it, we sort of see, we're attracted. We want to be like those people.
But is that subjective to individuals and cultures, that some individuals and cultures can look at some deed and say, hey, that's great, we want to emulate it, and others can say, oh, that's the epitome of evil, is to be avoided?
So put it this way, every human being faces the possibility of death at some point. And the excellence, the sort of strength of character that it takes to confront that might be, I'm not sure if it's a universal human excellence, but all human beings somehow understand why it would be excellent to be able to look death in the face and somehow not run away terrified. So that's not a metaphysical deduction of it or anything like that, but it is something that's rooted in the empirical human experience. And I would say the same thing about his discussion of justice, that justice solves a problem that is sort of objectively there in human life. It doesn't solve it perfectly, but it does address something that is undeniable once you start thinking about human beings seriously.
So courage in the face of death, justice, is there a list?
Yeah, so justice is an artificial virtue that tries to take care of a natural problem. But there are natural virtues that we praise just for themselves, and its greatness and goodness in the way that Jerry talks about, which, by the way, is a ripoff of Aristotle and Cicero, right? I mean, it really is the kalos and the agathos. And I think that he doesn't go back to Aristotle, he goes back to Cicero, but that he does think there's some kind of natural evidence that some people are superior. So.
Benjamin Franklin wrote a list. Go ahead.
Humility being a key one. Take pride in himself.
Yeah, exactly. Nelson.
I wanted to follow up on Gary's comment about miracles.
Yes.
At the beginning of your talk, you said something to the effect that you wanted to avoid the trap that some people fall into, thinking that all modern philosophers are just political propositions. And in the course of listening to Jerry and to some of the other things that were said, the following possible formulation occurred to me, which I'm not advocating. I just want to ask you whether it's you. That is radical questioning and seriousness, which you took that eventually liberated him to become a political propagandist.
So I'm not sure what do you mean by a political propagandist?
Somebody with a political program who writes in a way to advance that program without complete concern about whether it's true.
Are you saying that Hume is part of the modern attack on religion without having kind of an actual argument? I mean, this is in a way what Jerry was pointing to. Is that what you're concerned about?
I didn't mean just the religion, but also the politics of the commercial society and so on. Is that, the much broader political program includes Christianity, but other things, especially in commercial society.
Right.
I'm just asking whether the end result of the radical questioning is freedom to go and become what we could crudely call a political propagandist, political activist over a certain time.
Yeah. Well, you say propagandist like it's a bad thing. He's certainly a rhetorician, and he's certainly trying to make the case in ways that will persuade the audience that he has. Now, we'd actually have to look at the arguments. I mean, in the treatise, he makes the argument that commercial society serves certain, so far as we know, permanent human interests that are there regardless of what we think about human beings. And that if we understand ourselves correctly, we'll want to have a government that, we need to have a government because that's better than everyone beating each other up, but we also need to limit that government because being tyrannized is objectively a bad thing. So I don't think he understands himself as a propagandist.
No, I wouldn't think he did, but let me put it a little bit differently. Somebody who did not engage in radical questioning could sign on to that political project and do it very effectively,
Yes.
right? So my question really is about the relationship between his preliminary radical questioning and his later rhetoric, if you want to call it that anybody could have done. He was smart.
Yeah, okay, so he definitely is trying to make an argument to people who are not philosophers, and he's trying to justify a certain kind of society. As I understand him, I think he's trying to preserve a private sphere so that people like him are not going to get persecuted by a bunch of crazy zealots, right? Catholic or Protestant. So I think that he preserves the sense of radical questioning, but as a somewhat private possibility. It's actually complicated, but that's how he presents it in the essays. So I don't think he thinks of it as propaganda. I think he says to people who are not interested in questioning the way that he is as sort of a way of life, I think he thinks this is the best kind of society in which you're going to be able to lead your life and benefit yourself materially, and he thinks that that's better than the alternatives. So I think on that sense, he doesn't see himself as a propagandist. I think he sees himself as instituting a just regime, maybe for the first time, or something like that. So, Sarah Hauser's got a question.
I just wanted to pick up on something I think that John said when you guys first met. You were talking about the question of how much of a liberal Hume really is, and how
Right.
committed he is to sort of liberal political principles. And so, because if he's such a skeptic about metaphysics, doesn't that make him more sort of like a Burkean kind of conservative than a liberal in a Lockean sense?
So he certainly has a lot in common with Burke, but he also has a lot in common with Locke. And I think the right way to understand Hume is that he basically agrees with Locke that human beings can rebel, may rebel against tyrannical governments, and that's just a fact of human life. But that he thinks that it's not so smart to go around talking about it all the time, right? And so, and it's almost, I mean, he says that in almost so many words. So there's a famous passage in History of England in which after Charles I gets executed, and Hume really pulls out all the stops to make us all cry about the fact that Charles I is getting executed. And then the next line is, if there was ever a truth that should be hidden from the populace, the possibility of legitimately resisting and maybe even killing your monarch is certainly one of them, right? So here's this truth that you should never, ever talk about. But then he goes on to talk about it for 3 pages, right? I mean, it's sort of transparently, I'm a liberal pretending to be a conservative.
I guess, I mean, whether we should make it the status of it, I think everybody's sort of asking this question. What is the status of his moral or political claims given his metaphysical position? So, Locke has this whole why we have a right to revolution is based on this whole sort of theory of natural rights. But Burke, for example, also defends the glorious revolution and, tries to distinguish it from the French Revolution on sort of prudential grounds. And you think, Hume would be something like that?
Yeah, I don't think that there's any. It's not clear that for Hume, there's no rule maker up in the sky who says here are the rules that you should always follow, and you'll be punished if you don't. He thinks, that's the whole point of calling justice artificial. It's something that human beings have to create. But that said, the phrase is always it's artificial but not arbitrary. That it serves certain permanent human interests that we don't make up. They're not relative. They're certain things that everybody needs. And that it does have a kind of justification in human nature without it being some kind of, I have an absolute moral claim that I can make on the world that somehow has to be satisfied, or a categorical interpretation. He's not Kant for sure, but he is like Locke. Yeah. Paul.
You had your hand up? Okay, so I'll recognize a few more hands and then we'll call. So Paul, this gentleman, Martin, and Alex. Okay.
Tom, you said Socrates is not a deep model for Hume. It's kind of happenstance. Is there anybody he read that we could read? Or is there another philosopher that was a deep model for him? That someone else who defended the philosophical life in a similar or different way, or tried to influence politics?
Well, this is going to get me into more trouble. It's Machiavelli. Yeah, I think that's the. So, after I had this whole shtick of human Socratism, and I went around giving it, and felt like I was so smart, and then I read the essays, and I realized it's all Machiavelli, and so one of my friends said, "Oh, well, that's the next Hume Machiavellianism," right? But I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, it depends. Now, that depends on a particular interpretation of Machiavelli. That Machiavelli is actually interested in all this highfalutin philosophy stuff, and instead of just being sort of like, the propagandist for the Godfather, right? But yeah, I suspect that's where it comes from.
Was it direct, or was it through Montesquieu or someone?
So in the essays, let's just stay on the surface. In the essays, he says, I've got this great new political science, and all of it is taken, explicitly from Machiavelli, right? He says, my political science is better than the ancients, and what's his evidence? It's a long quote from Machiavelli's Florentine Histories about you can design institutions that will make for basically a perpetual republic, right? So on that level, there's no question in my mind that he at least gets the realpolitik part of Machiavelli.
I think the unintended consequences of telling a prince he can steal all the money,
Yes.
make your people richer so that you can steal it, and then it turns out that in fact what happens is a middle class arises and the prince winds up out of luck.
Right.
That's straight out of Bacon's Henry VII.
Right. And it's also a plausible interpretation of Machiavelli's Prince.
It is, well,
right?
of course.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
right. So he just summarized my reading of the commerce essays.
Yeah.
Just
My question related to On Miracles, it's been a while, but when I read On Miracles, I don't think he was talking about whether miracles exist or whether we should believe in them. And that gets me to this vision of, you say he's an atheist. When I looked at it 30 years ago, I thought the evidence was really uneven about whether he was an atheist or not. Which gets me to my question. Pascal, do you think Pascal had much influence on you? Especially, or perhaps the Jesuits that he associated
Yeah.
with while he was in France,
Right.
and their vision of Pascal.
yeah. So it's a great question. I mean, I think historically there's good evidence that Hume is reading Pascal. If I recall correctly, there are articles in which people try to spell out, and there's something that's very similar in spirit. Now, Pascal is going to end up saying you ought to gamble that God exists, and Hume is not, but the skeptical arguments are very similar. And I guess this touches on something that Jerry raised about miracles, that Hume wants to be like Spinoza, to have an argument that miracles don't make any sense and you shouldn't believe them politically. But the thrust of the rest of his thought is that we have to assume that nature is uniform. We don't have any evidence. That's sort of a grounding assumption. But if you have that thought, you really don't have any a priori argument against miracles, right? So Hume, in a way, has to be closer to at least some aspects of the religious argument.
And do you have, is there any textual evidence that you might give me about his rejection of Pascal's wager?
I don't think I have any evidence about that. I mean, there are lots of sort of anecdotal stories, right? Like, so when Hume is on his deathbed, and is it Adam Smith comes to speak with him?
No, Boswell.
Yeah, Boswell, that's right. And
Smith is there, but Boswell comes in.
yeah, and so Boswell's really concerned that Hume is going to die, right, without being forgiven, right, without repenting for all of his sins. And he says, please go ahead and repent. And I'm mixing the stories
Points
up in
to
my
the
mind.
Yeah, I think.
To the ember, the dead ember in the fire,
Yeah, so
or the coal in the fire, and he says, something like the odds of it's going to come back to life, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, so
right.
he'll take the odds it's not.
right. There's also the story in which he tells the story that Karen comes to take him across
Yeah.
the river Styx, and he says, no, please don't take me. I'm in the middle of this great project that I'd like to live long enough to finish. And what's that project? The project is destroying Christianity, and Karen says, what, you fool? If I let you try to finish that, you'll never die, right? So I don't know. Seems like atheism. Yeah.
That's in the Smith.
Yeah.
Yeah, pass.
If our notions of justice are non-arbitrary and rooted in human nature, the motion kind of invariably leads us to a certain range of reasonable options, then why call that artificial?
That's a great question. I think he wants to distinguish himself from the tradition of natural law that's been taken over by Christianity and basically by the Pope and people like that. And so he wants to emphasize the fact that these are human things, not divine things.
Maybe also in kind of opposition to a one-size-fits-all way of living in government.
I think that's right. I think there's a core of things that we need government to do, but beyond that, there's a lot of variation in how it does that and what particular political regime does that best. I think that's right.
Martin, last question?
My question is answered, I don't know if the other.
Well, then, I have a final comment that I have to make, because if you'll call, 800-656-6666, you can get a copy of this book.
6666.
And whatever, it has the
If you
following-
buy two, it's easier to understand.
This is relevant to the issue of Hume's anti-contract position. He's against the contract position because he doesn't think that it ever happened in history, and he's against it because it's dangerous, because you went around blabbing about this stuff. And so this is how Tom, I think, wonderfully puts his position. He does not say, do not assassinate the tyrant, only do not telegraph that you plan to do so. The contractarian doctrine is not wrong so much as imprudent. It gives up the advantage of surprise. That's worth the price of the book.
And surprise, surprise, our panel is over. Well, thank you all for really.
Answer that. Yeah.